All right. So before I start, I'm just going to acknowledge that we're here in Ohurmagun, which is on land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Anishinaabe nations to ensure we take what we need, leave enough in the dish for others, and keep the dish clean. It's important to note that this agreement precedes settlers. We can't assume that we're allowed to take part of the resources being shared, but it's an important practice to abide by these kind of treaty and wampum responsibilities of the places that we live. And in relation to data sharing, there are important protocols for Indigenous data sovereignty that are good to track on. So some of those can include the ownership, control, access, and possession, the OCAP course, which really directly relates to First Nations data. So we can share those after the presentation. I think one person has their mic on. Let me see if I can mute them. There we go. Okay. So we here at McMaster, we're part of the Sherman Center for Digital Scholarship in Mills Library. If you have anything, I just wanted to plug, if anyone is working with data analysis and visualization or data cleaning or access to data, podcasting, if you're doing kind of knowledge translation and outreach, we can help with that there. I have colleagues who have expertise in those areas. And then we're also part of a new digital research commons pilot, which has information security for researchers, software development, if that's something that you're doing, and also research impact. So kind of bibliometrics and measuring the impact of your research, but then also connections between researchers. So here at McMaster Research Data Services, my name's Danica. My colleague Emily is also on the call, and we can help with any questions about data security, storage and backup, data management, planning, data organization and documentation, and then also data sharing or archiving. So this is what we're going to do today. Not all of this will apply to you, but it's still useful to know as researchers in science and engineering. And I think your work probably overlaps with health sciences a little bit as well too. So we'll talk about what research data management is, some of the requirements so that you can be prepared for tri-agency requirements. And I'm going to focus on talking about NSERC requirements. So this is data management planning and data deposit. These are the two that have kind of rolled out. And then we'll go into sensitive data, security, and kind of risk assessment and anonymization. So we're going to start just by talking about data. I think data can take many forms, and different data can look very different in different fields depending on the kind of research that you're undertaking. So if you are thinking about if you're using it as a building block to produce new knowledge and understanding, it could qualify as research data. So this can be the more immediate things that we would definitely think about, like numbers and Excel spreadsheets and kind of instrumentation data, but then it can also include images and paper files and things like that too. And so you are going to have to tell me. I thought that you might have some data from wearable sensors and monitoring tools, surveys and questionnaires, focus group studies, and imaging. Yes, Emily.
Yeah, sorry, you're just still on the first slide. I wasn't
sure
if you were aware
it's not advancing, hey?
No.
Thank you for letting me know. It's still not going?
No,
Weird.
I still see the first slide.
Okay.
No, it's
Thank
moving.
you, everyone.
See the slide, I think.
What's that?
Yeah, I can see the slide that you're talking about, I think.
Oh, it's moving
you
for
can?
other people.
Yeah.
I just have
Okay. Thank
yeah, I can see them also.
Okay, never flashed again. My computer is
okay.
An issue.
Thank you, everyone. There is like a thing that lets you sync to my slide, or you can kind of like choose your own adventures. So like I think skip ahead in my slide. So that might be what's happening. Thank you, everyone, for letting me know. Okay, so we're going to start with a Menti. Emily will share the link in the chat, and I'm just going to share my screen again. And
it's got this shadow.
That's a shadow.
Yeah, I've already closed it.
Okay, can you see that Menti now? Probably you can. And Emily, you're sharing the link? Could someone just type hi in the chat and then I should have access to it from my other teams?
I'm really sorry. I'm just having trouble like getting to the chat suddenly.
Okay, no problem. You should be able to just screen the little thing in the corner too, or go to Menti and use this code. Beautiful. Okay, this is great. So we're seeing lots of sensor data. So we have wearable sensors, ambient sensors, dissolution data, time series, accelerations, binary mixtures, and then longitudinal surveys as well, and numbers. Okay, amazing. Solubility, time series, RF. Images, this is really interesting. It's quite a mix that you're working with, graphs. Yeah, wearables. Cool. Okay, thanks everyone. This is really helpful to see images, spectra, video. That's so great. Cool. Okay, thank you. Message logs. It's really neat. And audio too. Okay, great. This will be well aligned then. Okay. So thank you for that. That's really helpful. So I think the thing I wanted to start with just is to emphasize why research data management is important. This can be for you and for funders, but it's just that data are valuable on their own, not just what we publish from them. So for surveys and focus groups research, our interviews and relationships with our participants are valuable. This means that data security and data management planning are essential, and often focus groups kind of only happen once. We want to make sure that we store them correctly. In quantitative research, it can mean valuable from reproducibility, keeping the data from wearable technology safe from security threats. And then it could also mean that they're valuable to others, who are research participants who might want to see and work with our data set, or to other researchers. So when we talk about data management, we're really talking about a whole life cycle of collection and organization and documentation and storage and reuse. So in the beginning stages, we're going to talk about data management planning, and this is a kind of increasing grant requirement. And then we're going to talk about data sharing as well. Another way to see this is just that the publication is really only the tip of an iceberg that also includes secondary data, equipment, the collected data that we have, our ethics approval processes, our code and our software, and documentation and everything like that as well. So just at a glance to begin with, we'll talk about some RDM practices in the field. I've tried to find examples from your field, but they might be slightly off, I'm sorry. So one of these is pre-registration. So this is a thing in OSF, the Open Science Framework. And so sometimes people will declare what they intend to study and what they're aiming to, their study design, and things like that, so that it's kind of like a public accountability process when they get their data that they can kind of compare against pre-registration. We might also look at data management planning, which we will look at today. This is a Horizon 2020 Active Age project. This is using existing data sources. So this is a functional mobility assessment based on Canadian longitudinal study on aging data. And then also data sharing. And so this is a recent data set from Phil Kohlmeyer, who's in the electrical engineering department, on battery estimation example code shared in McMaster Dataverse. So data sharing is also a practice. Funders care about RDM for a number of reasons. One of the tri-agency's goals is to support Indigenous data sovereignty. We might also look at protecting research participants, so it aligns with kind of our national ethical standards. Reproducibility is another concern, so that we can feel kind of confident and trust research results. Providing public access to research, so often grants are publicly funded, and so providing public access to research results is important. Preserving research data is also important, so that we're not recreating the same data over and over again. And then also, like I mentioned, facilitating data reuse. Journals maybe have like similar but slightly different requirements. They are more interested in research integrity and avoiding data fraud. And so RDM practices really support principles of transparency and openness. We've shared this kind of like medicine is plagued by untrustworthy clinical trials. How many studies are faked or flawed? This was research done by a researcher named Carlisle. For more than 150 clinical trials, he got access to the data, and he judged that 44% of the trials contained at least some flawed data, impossible statistics, incorrect calculations, or duplicated numbers and figures. And 26% of papers had problems that were so widespread that the trial was impossible to trust, either because data was faked or that it just had too many errors in it. So he's talking about this idea of zombie trials, which is topical for Halloween, that at a first glance appear to be real research, but then when they get closer to you, are kind of like a reanimated shell masquerading as reliable information. And these are a problem because then they can make their way into systematic reviews and things like that. And then they're also interested in ensuring that data is accessible to other researchers. RDM practices overall make research just stronger. So data organization and planning saves you time and resources. Good storage and backup practices are good for data security. Secure data management protects research participants, and then depositing and sharing data openly increases accessibility of the research and allows others to reproduce and verify results. So I'm going to start by talking about the policy requirements so that you're kind of prepared for those as they arise. So in March 2021, the tri-agencies, so SSHRC, CIHR, and NSERC, released a research data management policy to advance Canadian research excellence. The policy has three kind of areas of interest. So the first is institutional strategies. We've developed ours here at McMaster. And then that's for universities, for researchers, they're looking at data management plans and data deposit. And I think it's actually just really interesting that they asked for institutional strategies because they are looking for ways to support researchers in meeting these requirements. Yeah, Delcia.
Hi, Danica. I'm not sure if it's just my slides or my screen, but I only seen your first slide.
Okay, I think Emily was having the same issue. If you look,
Okay.
there should be a little button at the bottom that says sync to presenter.
Okay.
Is that there? Please tell me if it is. It's the new present in Teams, but then it can be kind of tricky.
Sorry, if everyone else can see them, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. If nobody can see them though, please let me know and then we can correct that. So the first of these requirements is data management plans. So for certain funding opportunities, the agencies require data management plans to be submitted to the appropriate agency at the time of application. And so for NSERC, this is only currently in the subatomic physics discovery grants, both the individual and the project. That's what has rolled out for the pilot this year. We had one NSERC grant that required a DMP this fall, and also 3 CIHR grant applications requiring a DMP. So these are just the kind of pilot projects right now, but we're estimating that after this pilot stage, a lot more will be requiring a data management plan. They recommend using DMP Assistant, and they are asking for approximately 2 to 3 pages, but it doesn't count in your application. And they're saying that DMPs might be reviewed at the midterm stage. So this is also a requirement for the National Institutes of Health, the International Development Research Center, and several other grants as well. Yes, wrong.
So the DMP assistant is some kind of government portal for
Yes, it's not a
manage
government
data?
portal. It's not a government portal, but it's a tool that is available to researchers, kind of organized by the national platform. And
Okay.
it has been approved by the tri-agencies for use for the requirement.
So does it contain all the entire workflow? Or
Yeah,
data management? Okay.
I'll show you in a couple slides what it looks like, because it's essentially just a form, but it's a fancy form that has the right questions, and then there are some guidance along the side for specifically for McMaster.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what is a data management plan, just to kind of frame that for you? Even the tri-agencies acknowledge that this is a project-specific living document describing how you will create and store and organize and document research data. It doesn't compel you to manage data any differently. It's just a way of kind of getting you to articulate what your plan is so that it can be reviewed. And it asks you how you'll manage your data both during the active phases of research, so when the research is actually occurring, but then also after completion of the research project. So that sometimes we'll see things in ethics application that's like the data will be stored for 5 years. And so a data management plan will ask you, where will that be stored? Who will be responsible in the course of those 5 years and things like that. And they're also a great way to kind of anticipate and identify challenges. So when you can see it all spelled out, and even just in the act of writing it, it can help you find areas that you might need to work out. I recently did one for a survey in Qualtrics, and it let me see that Qualtrics backups are not robust enough for preserving the data. So we had to incorporate some kind of like manual backup for the Qualtrics data while it was in there. So that's the kind of thing that a DMP can help you identify. So in a nutshell, these are the kind of areas that a DMP will look for. The first is data collection. So what will your files look like? How will they be named? How will you version control them? Documentation and metadata is like, do you have an electronic notebook? Are you describing your process? Are you working with any variable systems specifically in your field? And I imagine in your field that there might be some of those that you would need to track on. It'll ask you about storage and backup. So where will you store your data? How will you make sure that it's backed up? Preservation. And so this is slightly different than data sharing, but where might you store it in the long term after the project is complete? And then sharing and reuse. So if you're sharing for reproducibility reasons or anything like that. Responsibilities and resources is a really important section that often researchers will miss. And so this is asking you who will be responsible for the data in the long term overall. So if you are storing data for 5 years, who will be responsible for that? If they have to step back for whatever reason, if they break a leg or move to another country or go to a different institution, who will hold the responsibility there? And then ethics and legal compliance. And so I imagine for those who are engineers, there are often a lot of commercial constraints on data, and especially related to data sharing. And then ethically, you're also working with human participant data. So it's an opportunity to articulate how you'll manage that sensitive data. Beyond just a grant requirement, I know you are all working on projects together. So a DMP can be a useful tool beyond just submitting it for a grant. Research is a team effort, and you can collaborate together on the DMP with staff and partners and students, co-PIs, ethics boards, things like that. It's a living document that reflects the inevitability of change, so it's supposed to be updated on an ongoing basis. And you might say, I don't really know what I'm doing yet. That's okay, it's a living document, so it should not just be like a thing that you complete for your grant application and send in and forget about. The tri-agencies are anticipating maybe a mid-grant review of a DMP to see how it's changed since you submitted it in the first place. And also it's just helpful to kind of use it as a document. So we're seeing a lot of labs now developing data management plans as a workflow or onboarding or process document. And even if they're not applying for our grant, they just kind of do it to organize their team. It's really helpful for accountability and good data practices. So when someone new comes to the group, then they read the DMP and kind of get up to speed that way. So we have a data management plan database. This is a very new tool that has a whole bunch of data management plan examples from across the world. You can search by field or location or funder. So if you're applying to an NSF grant or a NIH grant, you can kind of select those grants. We also have examples specific to Canada for that align with the tri-agency models. So if you select location Canada, those will come up. And I've also found some DMPs from Horizon 2020 that relate to kind of mobile technology for research. So I can send those along. They're very long and they're more in the kind of like process document camp, but still could be helpful to see. So here's an example. This is one of the ones from the Horizon 2020 grants. This is a European grant. And so this is one that has kind of like a process that they're describing from day one as a screening and consent and collection assessment. The second day would be multi-sensor systems. The third day is just single sensor, or actually that's day 1 to 9. This is from home, and then in the lab on day 9, they are doing another multi-sensor system experiment. So this kind of lets you write out the details of how you'll be handling the data. And so this is DMP Assistant. This is a web-based planning tool that's available to all researchers in Canada. It's available through the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, but in partnership with the tri-agencies, they're inviting people to use the Portage template. So if you are required to make a DMP in the future, if you'd like to try one out, DMP Assistant is a great free tool that kind of lets you answer questions. And it's just helpful to be asked the questions because it invites you to think about different things to consider. And just to note also, you can send it to us for review and we can mark it up and have a consultation with you to talk about. So we're going to go to Menti again. I'm just going to share the screen. The second screen. It will be the same as before, so if you still have it open, that will be great. Okay. So yeah, this is just like thinking about our research in your research teams who could potentially be involved in creating or reviewing a data management plan. And I'm kind of curious to see specifically who in your research groups is involved, because I think it really varies a lot from team to team. Yeah, so PI project lead, absolutely that person will be involved in creating and reviewing a DMP. Yes, student postdoc researchers. Yes, definitely them too. And that's good for 2 reasons. So often students are involved in data collection and management. And it's also just helpful to have them involved for a learning opportunity too, because then you can kind of discuss it as a group and then know best practices. Student researchers, yes. MEB for sure is a great group to review a data management plan. And actually, we're seeing people sometimes create a data management plan in advance of an ethics application so that all of those details are kind of ironed out when they engage with ethics. Sometimes other people will do a data management plan after an ethics application, and then you can kind of draw information for your data management plan from the ethics application. So really, they're kind of like, they really closely relate. Research coordinators, definitely, yes. A research coordinator, often the people that I work with the closest are research coordinators who will be kind of like doing the first draft of the DMP. Those that might run larger scale analytical instrument facilities on campus. Yeah, that's a great suggestion that some of those kind of like the facilities themselves would review it and make sure that it's in alignment with their best practices. That's a cool answer. Okay, I think that's a really great overview, everyone. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go on, but I will leave this open. If you think of anything as we go, we're going to return to this slide from when we bit later in the presentation. Okay. So that is data management planning. That's the main requirement that's active right now. Data deposit and sharing, I'll also just talk about briefly. So this is in the tri-agency data research data management policy, but it's not currently in effect. So they are saying that grant recipients will be required to deposit data into a digital repository, all research data, metadata, and code that support journal publications and preprints. Grant requirements will not be required to openly share data. So this is an important distinction, that you need to deposit data, but it might not be kind of publicly available. It's not yet a requirement for NSERC data, and the rollout will kind of review. It'll likely roll out in 2025, I think is what we're hearing currently. But I thought I'd mention, I wonder if any of you apply for NIH grants. Rong, is that something that your group would be applying for?
Not in my group, but I know there are some colleagues in CAST who have, I think, have some applications.
Okay, thank you. That's perfect. So yeah, the NIH has already rolled out a data management and sharing policy, and it's interesting that it's not just a data management and sharing policy. They're also looking, or just data management. They're also really emphasizing data sharing. They say scientific data should be made accessible as soon as possible. So if you are writing an NIH grant, they are requiring data management plans as well. There's a different tool available for them. And then they're also requiring data sharing. So we have some examples of NIH like recommended repositories, that if that is of interest. What are we talking about when we are talking about deposits? So deposits are when a research data collected as part of a project are transferred into a research data repository. Data repository is a web platform and storage space for researchers to deposit data sets associated with the research. So there are a couple of benefits to this. Repositories can provide long-term storage and access to data beyond the life of the grant or a research project, or even just someone's individual career. And it allows for discoverability as well, because there are a lot of things like author and title and the link to the publication, a link to the data itself, that kind of allow for it to be more easily findable. So some of you might have heard FAIR in terms of science research. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so depositing in a repository really supports those FAIR principles. They're also just easy to use shared platforms that are specifically designed for researchers. So beyond just providing access to data and making sure that it's preserved, it might help you comply with audits. Journals are now asking for folks to share data to reproduce or verify results. It can help keep data there instead of losing it, and keep it organized. And it creates a long-lasting record of your work. So there are lots of benefits to depositing data, and we can talk more about that if people are interested. And just some options for depositing research data. So if you are working with clinical data, there's a repository called Vivly, which is a nonprofit org for clinical research data. There are also domain-specific repositories. So this Nature article has kind of a list of potential repositories. We might also talk about code repositories like GitHub. That's a way of sharing code. And then we also have general repositories. So you saw Phil Kohlmeyer's data set. That's in McMaster Dataverse, which is here at McMaster. And there's also a Canadian repository. So that's that for the requirement section. We're going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about sensitive data management, and specifically kind of best practices for caring for human participant data. So this doesn't necessarily align with those research data management policy requirements, but this is important in responsibilities in relating to our Tri-Council policy statement on ethical conduct for research involving humans. So this will relate more to the kind of meeting ethics board requirements. We talk a lot about sensitive data. So a good way of just assessing this is how embarrassed you might be if your data was published on the front page of a newspaper. There's some guidance that MREP has on research data management, they can assess if your data will be low risk, medium risk, or high risk. And this spectrum of risk will kind of impact how you will share and store data, or if you share data at all. A kind of example of, it's kind of interesting to note, it's human participant data, but it might also include things like commercial information. If that data might lead to a patent or things like that, it could also be considered sensitive data. So the survey data that you mentioned would definitely relate to that, as well as potentially some of the monitoring data, depending. The requirements, it's not just the ethics requirement that we need to be aware of, but also the kind of different policies, which we've talked about already, potentially data sharing and transfer agreements, if that is something that you are working on in terms of kind of commercial research. Journals might have requirements around data sharing or availability that would relate to this. And then we also need to be aware of privacy legislation. So I'll start by talking about de-identification. So this will definitely be for survey data, and it might relate to other data as well. De-identifying and anonymizing data is an important security measure for human participant and sensitive data. So I think we all maybe have heard of, like, we need to password protect our servers. So that's a great start, but it's definitely not enough. And there are a couple of things that we can do to make sure that data is extra secure when it's sensitive. So the TCP/2 kind of separates different kind of types of de-identification. So we might see coded information. So the direct identifiers, so names and dates of birth and things like that, are replaced with a code. With access to a code, it's possible to re-identify participants. So if your code is kept, it needs to be stored on a different device. We might also see anonymized data, so data that kind of has the direct identifiers removed. There's no code kept, so the risk of remaining indirect identifiers is pretty low then. We might also see anonymous information. So if you're doing surveys, this information might never have had identifiers associated with it. So anonymous surveys. And in this case, the risk of re-identification is quite low. And then just to note that this does not guarantee privacy, but we can tell research participants how we're going to be handling this as we go. This I won't get too deep into, but you'll have this in the slides. This is a really neat visual that kind of shares the different kinds of de-identification. And you can see that there are many different degrees of identifiability based on different kinds of data and different ways of de-identifying it and storing it. So I'm just going to talk quickly about direct and indirect identifiers. So this is especially important for survey data to keep track of. Direct identifiers would be names, initials, relatives. Like, these things are, I think, pretty clear. We might look at biometric or genomic data. These are, of course, very identifiable. And then photo, audio, or video. So I think you mentioned both audio and video. Those will often be, and we see this in the media all the time. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and sometimes we'll see like somebody's voice being modified, and that's why, because tone of voice can be really identifying. But then there are also, it's good to think about indirect identifiers as well. These are also known as quasi-identifiers. And so on their own, they might not be able to identify the person, but if you have them in combination with other identifiers, it can really quickly, easily lead to identification. So we might think of a person living in Toronto who is female, they have a university degree, and they're married between the ages of 40 and 55, and they've got an income between $60,000 and $75,000. So there's probably definitely more than 5 people in Toronto who meet that requirement. And so it shouldn't have any we shouldn't be able to find that person. But if we have some other identifiers. So let's imagine the age group is slightly older, and we know that these are individuals in a certain retirement facility. So if that's the case, then we can imagine that it might be really easy to identify that person, given that they're part of a smaller group, and maybe they have other kind of data include like their immigration status or their family composition, like how many children they have, and those can quickly identify someone. So it's important to remember that we we know the immediate direct identifier removal, but then there are other things that can also lead to re-identification. So there's some guidance, and if you're doing this, please reach out. We can help you with this. Another way of de-identifying data could be pseudonymization or generalization or suppression. So pseudonymization, we know pretty clearly from journalism. We might say, like, let's we have a friend called Schnabika, but the pseudonymization is not enough. It's pretty easy to know who that person is. So we might look at generalization, grouping specific values into categorized ranges. So age ranges could be built into relevant groups. So we might see kind of like 55 to 65. That allows for enough generalization that we might not be able to identify that person. And if you're not able to, then you might look at suppression, which is just deleting individual cases or responses, which can sometimes affect data. But if there's one individual in a particular range of like one ethnicity, the ethnicity response for that individual might be deleted to preserve the ethnicity category as a whole. So you might keep the individual's other results, but just remove their ethnicity. So there are ways of kind of working with this data to make sure that it is safer. A way to look at this in practice, we can see replacing names. You can replace with pseudonyms, but you can also just relate to the role. So we might have kind of resident 1, 2, 3, and then let's say we have like a physio that's working with them. So physio 1, 2, 3. We might replace ages with bins. So I'm a student who's 25 to 30 instead of 28. Ambiguating dates to the season instead of the date specifically, and then ambiguating the place they live into kind of more generalizing information. A way to test this is k-anonymity. So this is a mathematical approach to ensure data sets are anonymous. And essentially, you're just looking for data sets to not isolate a group any further than 5 identical individuals. So that's a kind of way of testing. There are also some great de-identification packages. We've shared Amnesia and SED Micro there. And if this is of interest, there are a couple more resources that are available in terms of reducing risk. One of the things to note is that I think I mentioned earlier, if you have a linking file or key, if you're a student, like replacing people's identification with a code, your data is not anonymous if the linking file exists. So if you are doing this, you want to make sure that linking files are encrypted and stored on separate devices or systems than the data. So you want to keep them on 2 different storage platforms so that they're not like hiding in the same place, because if they're hiding in the same place, then they are effectively identifying. If you include the linking file, it should be deleted when no longer required to increase privacy. Just a note that recording and transcripts are more inherently identifiable than, just the video recordings are more inherently identifiable than the transcripts. So researchers should transcribe recordings and limit access, and you can delete original recordings once they're no longer needed. So once you have a transcript, it's best practice to delete the original recording. And direct identifiers in the transcripts can be pseudonymized or generalized where possible. So the best practice is to have the video recording of the focus group or the interview, and then transcribe it, and then delete the original, and then de-identify the transcript itself. There are also important administrative controls to consider when working with sensitive human participant data. Don't collect identifiers that aren't relevant to your research. It's important to de-identify information as soon as possible and work from the de-identified data, not from the identifiable data where possible. Like I mentioned, store linking files separately, and then this principle of least privilege. So this is an important consideration for security. I've included a link there that you can click. But it's really that data should only be made accessible to team members who need access. So if they don't need access, you need to remove them from that. There are other also technological controls that are important. So we talked about password protected devices as being the bare minimum, but data also that is connected to the internet also needs to be encrypted. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but encryption is an important consideration for data that's stored on internet connected devices. Data should be stored in secured environments or a server rather than an individual computer or device. That's just best practice to kind of keep it in a secure location instead of this object that's kind of like moving around with us in person. And data should be encrypted and password protected when it's shared. And of course, do not use email for high-risk data, and even best practice, don't use it for medium-risk data either. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about storage now, because I think I mentioned that if data is connected to the internet, it needs to be encrypted. Public cloud services, I don't know if folks use Google Drive or Dropbox, you can't use this for medium or high-risk data. Institutional services, because we have an agreement with them as the university, they have been approved for use with medium risk data, provided that they're used in combination with encryption. So this could be Backdrive or OneDrive. OneDrive is a bit less flexible when working with outside collaborators. So I think we might have folks on the call from different universities. But there are possibilities with SharePoint and Teams to kind of add guests. So that should not be a huge problem, but it just can be a little bit finicky. MacDrive also has some interesting things if you're working with different sites that you can create a shared folder that collaborators can access, and you can create encrypted folders within MacDrive as well. MacDrive also has an interesting upload-only feature that we're seeing people use for things like MRI data. Someone was doing a data drop that they were looking for with MRI data. So then they had an upload-only folder, and people from across the different sites would upload data to the upload-only folder. So they can't see each other's data, but they can still share it with the researcher, and that can be helpful. And of course, when you're using cloud storage, you need to make sure that you're enabling security features as well. We have this data storage finder tool. This is a really helpful web tool that allows you to select for risk and volume and other needs and compare kind of McMaster-specific options. The best practice, so we talked about data storage. We also just need to talk about backup strategies. One of the things to consider with this is both ransomware. We're seeing this increasingly with universities, especially when there's like very sensitive research data. That data can be valuable, and if it's sensitive, then there's a higher impetus on you to kind of like pay the ransom. So backup strategies are one of the ways that can help with this, that you have a backup copy as well, in addition to just good security best practices. So you want to have at least 3 copies of your data, 2 on hand, so a production copy and a working copy, and a backup copy, and then 1 copy on an offsite location, so that you just want 2 different systems. So if one of them fails, you have a backup. So just to say, I think we've talked about a bunch of more kind of intricate things, but all of the normal security things apply for sensitive data too. So we know we need to use strong passwords. We know that we need to use multi-factor authentication. Using antivirus software is good. And I won't go into this, but I have some links for where you can download that from the McMaster stores and different sites. Enable your operating system security features. Microsoft Defender has a really good firewall, and then Mac also has a firewall. You can install privacy browser extensions to make sure that those invisible trackers aren't there and you're not getting malware or anything like that. And then just make sure that you do software updates. So I know we know most of these things already, but I just like to mention it because it's important to absorb that, yeah, it's just not, we think of these kind of more detailed things, but also the basics can be helpful as well. I mentioned encryption, which needs to be used if you're working with data that's connected to the internet, but it can be helpful even if you're like using a laptop to do your research, even if it's not connected to the internet, or a computer that's not connected to the internet. Encryption can help. And encryption is basically just like scrambling data so that only it becomes unscrambled only when the password is in there. So you want to encrypt individual files. This is possible in Microsoft and other applications. You could encrypt your whole hard drive. So this is available on Windows. This would kind of protect every file on your device, so you don't need to worry about accidentally missing a file. Or you can create a virtual encrypted disk. So there are ways of kind of just adjusting this so that you can kind of store sensitive files securely. And MacDrive actually has an option for a virtual encrypted disk as well. So it is good. This is definitely useful if you're working with medium risk data. If you're working with high risk data, it's best practice just not to connect it to the internet at all. I'll mention quickly, if you're working with surveys, we have a bunch of different options at McMaster here. Use MFA, and then you can also use roles and permissions. Often this is you can set this up in the survey itself. There are activity logs, especially in REDCap, that are available to ensure like quality assurance, and you can include this as part of your DMP. If you are working with the survey that is publicly available, we've been seeing from researchers that there are increasing bot attacks that are quite frustrating, especially if there is like any sensitive data or sensitive topics that are available. So things to support that are setting up a CAPTCHA, ensures that you're working with a human being. You can also restrict entries to one IP address so that you can't get many from the same one. Setting up email validation, so people get an email that they have to approve through in order to get access to the survey. You can say consent consequences, so if you fill out the survey and you are not a valid person, there will be consequences. And then also timestamps, so if you get 13 or 400 different entries from the same time that look very similar, it's a way of kind of removing those. So I just wanted to mention that because we have been seeing that quite a bit from researchers. When you're evaluating third-party services, I don't know how many third-party services you work with, and it might be interesting to hear that, but essentially you just want to make sure that data storage is located on Ontario. If you are working with these third-party services, you should de-identify data when possible. And then just to note that we have, if you're working with transcription, we have some guidance documents available soon. Finally, you want to think about long-term and archival storage. So think about where you want to store your data long-term. Many research funders will require data to be retained for a set period. Storing data on campus servers, we have access to department or faculty servers in some cases and RHPCS. This is preferable to storing data on an external hard drive. And publishing or depositing de-identified restricted access data is possible if that's something that you like, and that's a great way of preserving data. And then just to note, we do have information security services. So if you're working with anything complicated, I know some of the wearables are kind of like IoT devices, and that can be kind of tricky sometimes for security purposes. And so we do have services available here at McMaster that can help support that. If you email C/ just the email address there, the CIT security, Miro Slavchika is our IT security specialist, and he can help you kind of like brain out different kind of situations and how to update things. So finally, I wanted to note that data management plans are security and accountability tools too. So I'm going to leave this open and we'll switch back to the Menti. But now that we've talked a little bit about the different parties involved, let's return to the idea of reviewing a DMP and who might be involved in thinking about how you're going to plan and organize your data, who might be interested in reviewing or seeing the DMP, maybe not in the creation stage, but definitely once it's developed. So I'm going to switch back to that now. So same question as before, who could potentially be involved in creating or reviewing a DMP? And there are a couple of things that we talked about today that might be added here. And again, you can scan the Menti or go to the thing. Yes, stakeholders, absolutely. So we could think about if you're working with research kind of organizations or community organizations, those people could review the DMP. You might even offer the DMP available to your research participants. Yeah, a DMP committee is such a good idea for those large multi-center trials because often you'll be collaborating across all of those groups. So you need to be on the same page of how you'll be organizing that data. And sometimes I'll just note on that point, we've seen people do a very large process-based DMP for the whole project that's like 50 pages long. And then they kind of draw from that for these kind of this smaller projects. So you might have kind of like an overall umbrella DMP that kind of addresses best practices. And then those can be copied into these smaller DMPs for more specific needs. Yeah, the funding agency. So we talked about the tri-agency and the NIH requirements. So a funding agency could definitely review a DMP. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe at the initial stage and then also at the end. Anyone, anything else that we could imagine? Is there anyone at McMaster that we might want to have review the DMP other than MREB? Is hiding. Yay, yes, RDM office will be happy to review your DMP. We would love to. We can also set up a consultation with you if you would like, and then we can kind of talk more details about your DMP. That we're happy to do that. Anyone else? Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to share for a few final slides. But I'll leave that open. If anyone has further thoughts, please enter them there. All right. So just thinking about the future of DMP, I like to look down the road at the end of these things. So we're definitely seeing more increasing data management plans for all major grant applications, and we can see that just increasing more as time goes forward. As a research best practice as well. And I think people are starting to find them very useful for organizing data strategies and systems. Like we said, the Data Management Plan Committee would be a great place for kind of getting on the same page for research best practices. We're seeing more and more data availability statements, and in some cases, data sharing required for top journals. So you might need to make data available on request by email, but really if you share data in a repository, it kind of takes the pressure off you to respond to all of those requests individually. We're going to likely see more and more data depositor sharing requirements by major grants as well. Just on a local level, some developments to watch out for. The tri-agency is going to be implementing DMP requirements. We are seeing it already starting in 2023 and will likely continue in 2024. They are doing consultations on data deposit now and until later this year. We have a community data toolkits workshop that's developing in early 2024. So if that's of interest to you at all, if you're working with community partners through your research, I think some of you might be, please reach out to me and we would love to have you get involved. We're also seeing a controlled access management pilot with the Digital Research Alliance. So this will be restricted access with kind of a locked down data set that you as a researcher or you as a research team would be able to grant access to as you see fit. And then we're seeing increasing journal requirements for data availability statements and data sharing. I also wanted to mention we have a data management community of practice. You're all welcome to join. This is an interesting place to kind of have local discussions. So yesterday we had Michelle Dion, who does political science research, and Phil Kohlmeyer talking about the different facets of data sharing from their different perspectives. So that was really interesting. If that's of interest, please come. We also have the channel here, and then you'll get little updates about RDM. And finally, we're here for you. So please reach out. We are happy to kind of talk things through with you at any time. We can review DMPs. We can talk about where you're storing data and things like that. So that's it for my slides, but maybe we'll leave the last 5 minutes for any questions that people have. And I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you and also see the chat. Thanks, Ron. Thanks for having us. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, that's a very informative. Any question from the audience? The first question always the hardest. Let me just ask one.
Okay, thank you.
So I think for me, it's absolutely very important to put together a plan, but also executing the plan can be challenging, especially university setup where you have students graduating. There's a churn in your team. Like for instance, the password-based protection of your data. If you just, you need to have a good way to revoke that access. Oftentimes people don't bother to do that, right? So I guess the question is, are there tools that help us to keep track of whether we are compliant with the plan that was in place?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And those kind of roles and permissions assessments are really, really important to track on. If you are using, like we offer Bitwarden, or we recommend Bitwarden as a password manager. So that will allow for kind of group organization. So then you could revoke access to kind of a collection of passwords, which can be helpful in kind of maintaining those systems. And then also having a kind of ongoing security check that you kind of implement across like if you review your DMP every 3 months as a team, then you can kind of check and make sure that anything needs to be changed. Because I think you're so right. People write a plan and we talk about it as a living document, but it's really, things happen and we get busy, and it's kind of sometimes hard to make sure that you're following the plan itself. So making sure that that's part of an ongoing review, and then also making sure it's part of onboarding processes too. So when new researchers join the team, then they kind of like get this package that talks them through what they need to be doing. And so we're seeing people using the DMP assistant as a starting place to build a DMP, but you might kind of have other documents that you want to add in there, like SOPs and things like that as well.
Yeah, thanks.
And I'm hopeful that we'll see even more in the future. There are things like machine actionable DMPs that we're hearing talk about. That would be incredible and would automate some of these processes that would make it a lot easier to kind of actually use it and track it.
Even generating those plans.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah. I see we have a question from Mylin.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. This is all very new to me, so my question may be a little bit fundamental and naive, but you mentioned that it's a live or living document. So what would be the time frame that you would recommend in terms of revising your DMP, especially when you're looking at longitudinal sort of studies where it's ongoing?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think it will really depend on the nature of the study about how quickly things would be changing. But I think it's usually good half a year, like at least twice a year, if that's possible. And then even more if things are changing a little bit more quickly. If you're finding that you've had like 3 meetings and still nothing's changed, then it's probably okay to just switch it over to once a year, especially for those kind of longitudinal studies. But it's good just to keep it kind of active as a process.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
And not fundamental at all. And I will just say too that especially for some of these practices have been in place for many, many years. Like there are a lot of folks in science and social science who've been doing this for a really long time, but other disciplines, like I think Phil was saying yesterday that open data is not something that a lot of colleagues have considered in engineering yet. So, and they're just starting to develop those practices. So we're all learning and setting up these systems together. So there are no silly questions. It's just, we're all trying to do better kind of thing.
Thank you.
I have another question about about open data. So you kind of touch upon like a lot of funding agency or the project actually requires to release the data. I wonder whether it's something like equivalent to like open source software that you can put license agreement to those artifacts as to, for example, it can be only used for academic purposes and but for commercial uses, you could potentially charge for those access.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Like in terms of data licensing even. So we often will see repositories using Creative Commons licenses. Those are kind of very common, which of course has kind of carve outs for, you might say, attribution or non-commercial, or you might not change. So those kind of things can be set up. But it yeah, you can add a license. It's important to add a license to data so that people know how to use it. And often that's a requirement when you deposit data, that you'll select from a drop-down menu of potential licenses. And then a lot of them, you can kind of add a custom license as well. So if you wanted to kind of like have it open for researchers or not for others. Another way to do that would be the restricted access feature. And so Dataverse is not great for sensitive data. So there are, like, you can lock down a data set, but it's not great for those kind of like human participant data sets. However, you can add restricted access. So that might be another way that you could kind of grant access to whoever you as a researcher or as a research team determine is the right person to use it. So that's a way of mediating a little bit. You can kind of request that people tell you what institution they're from, what the purpose of the data is, do they have an ethics application, all of those things. And then you can grant access and say, yep, you can have this for free, or maybe we want to charge for it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. One last question.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about the Digital Alliance, because we actually use Digital Alliance for like training our machine learning models, which
cool.
often involves uploading those data we collected from participants to their online storage. So are you saying that because there's some agreement or understanding how Digital Alliance safeguard the data, researchers do not need to be concerned whether there are issues about risks, temporarily or at least for a period of time store the data there?
Yeah, we definitely recommend the kind of rapid access service and the other Digital Research Alliance of Canada storage options as a very viable option for researchers. And it would just be with the ethics board that you need to make sure that they're okay with it too. But it sounds like they are, and that makes total sense to me. It's the Alliance has a lot of protection in place kind of through those formerly Compute Canada resources. So that's another.
Yeah, in a case like high risk data, like you mentioned, has to be kept within Canada, we can assume that the storage are actually follow that, right, with Digital Alliance.
Yes, exactly. All of the Digital Research Alliance servers are in Canada. So yeah, that meets that requirement for sure. And yeah, if it's of interest, the reason that they like to see that, or that ethics boards like to see that, is because of the fact that it's in privacy legislation that we've confirmed is in Canada. If it's in the United States, then there might be issues with the Patriot Act and surveillance and things like that. So that's why they like to see Canadian servers. But no, that's a good one to go to.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the detailed presentation. I think there are a lot of students can benefit from the material. I don't know whether Delcia check with you, is it okay we share the video and audio slides as well my website?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so let's give Danica a round of applause, and thanks everyone, and have a nice weekend.
You too. Thanks for inviting us, Rong. It was really, really great to speak with everyone.
Okay, see you.